So I've got the pleasure of sitting down with Tessa Wernink, who came over from Amsterdam to Bristol for this conversation. And Tessa is a changemaker and activist with a wealth of knowledge in using business as a force for good and for transforming businesses so they can ultimately be as impactful as possible through her consultancy. And Tessa has really had an interesting career from being the founder of Fairphone, one of the coolest organisations leading the change in mobile phone and e-waste change. And now Tessa runs Wholeworks and the Undercover Activist, which both focus on organisational change and workplace resilience. So really interested in this talk today. Without further ado, Tessa Wernink. Tessa, welcome to sunny Bristol.
Thank you.
We are here for the Blue Earth Summit, which is going to be a really awesome couple of days. I think we're going to see hundreds of inspirational speakers in the space of sustainability, business, activism, adventure, the outdoors.
I'm excited.
Yeah, it's going to be good, isn't it? It's going to be really good. And you're speaking.
Yes.
Which is going to be very exciting. Maybe we should talk about that in today's conversation. But I wanted to actually start with something that I got very inspired by. In fact, I got like the warm, fuzzy feeling when I read it, which is the cover on your LinkedIn profile. Activism is love made visible.
Nice.
It is very nice.
People still go to profile pages, which is good news, good to know. But yeah.
But those words, activism is love made visible. I'm so intrigued by the roots of that.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Well, I'm going to ask you later, obviously, why you were moved by it, but I can give you my my answer of how we came up with that and why it's so important to us. I think it's clear that activism is a loaded term, and that for a lot of people it can be quite negative. So others it's positive. But we're quite intentional about using the word activism or employee activism because while it's seen as protest, what we think is what underlies that protest is the sense of really strong values or things that you see that you really care about. So I think when people do step up and take action, it's because they really want to change something. So, and that changing something is not because they're against something, but it's because they're for something. So that's why we say it's love made visible.
I mean, so you just talked about values there.
Yeah.
I mean, most businesses have got values.
Yes.
Seems a bit fluffy in business terms now, isn't it? Values. Why is that so important?
Why are values important? Yeah. Oh, it's a good question. I think it's because it really defines cultures. Like what you value is what you step up and do. It defines communities, and I think that it's something that we don't really know until we see certain behavior. And I think that what's so fluffy in business about culture, like a purpose and values, is that it's become an exercise of businesses, usually at the top, where they define their purpose and then they name a couple of values, and they don't ground it or root it in any kind of behavior that people can kind of say, okay, so that's what positivity or collaboration or whatever means. So it just becomes these empty terms. And I was speaking to somebody the other day that values is actually not enough. You should maybe take one step deeper and call them core narratives. So what are the narratives that underlie how you grew up? And we're all part of these different systems, your family system, your school system, your community system. And each of these, I think, have narratives or values that you unconsciously have taken with you through life and that you search for when you join a company.
It's really interesting because you kind of have that perspective of values written on a wall with some really cheesy stock image behind them. Do you think that companies can evolve their values?
I mean, we can be maybe negative about the fact that companies have decided to name their values, but it is a first step. Yeah. I think it's something that hasn't been visible, and that are unwritten rules on how you behave in a company. So if that is the first step to visualizing what's important in a company, then it's good, but you can't stop there. You really need to ground them in behavior and maybe even habits, and to make that really intentional. So some of the things that we suggest with companies is to really find stories or behaviors, things that happen on an everyday basis, and say it out loud. So I really liked what you did at that meeting, like you spoke up around for somebody, you know, and that really, to me, stood for blah, 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 value or something, so that you actually give it some body.
This is that kind of appreciative feedback
that
I guess helps move organisations from one state to another.
Yes. Yeah, I remember it, like work that I had. So it's mentioning when something adheres, I guess, to a value, but also when it doesn't. The way that, you know, we really stand for collaborative behavior, or we're a really open company. And if I don't know what you're doing on a daily basis, you know, I don't really know how to engage with you or something, you know, so that you become more conscious of what these values actually mean.
What's like the importance of collaboration right
Yes.
now is greater than ever, right? Are we seeing that in the business sense, in the wider sustainability community? Is that, and has that been impacted, especially after the global pandemic?
Collaboration. I think, I don't know, it's such a big question. I don't know if collaboration has been impacted. I think what I try to do is a little bit different from collaboration, and it's about collective leadership. So how can we acknowledge that everybody has agency, you know? So there's this kind of feeling of personal leadership. How can I take action? You get a lot of, like, every job is a climate job. It's not just the sustainability department. So if I see something, how can I, you know, step up, and how can I then collaborate with somebody who maybe also doesn't have a sustainability job, you know? So I think collaboration has always been around. Some people are better at it than others, but we also need people who are loners. But I think it's about leadership as well.
So going back to that line, activism is love made visible. Like, when did you write that? Was that at a kitchen table over coffee, a glass of red wine?
Yeah, I don't know. I set up Undercover Activist with my business partner, Veronique Winkels, and we were thinking about our website, like what kind of quotes or what things like resonate with you. And this one came up, and we were both like, did we make that up? And I was like, I don't know. Like, shall I Google it? Is it anywhere? We couldn't find it anywhere. So it's like, it's not a quote. It's not ours. I don't know what it is, but it's something that emerged, I think, from our work, and it's really. I don't like to use it as a payoff, because then it can become a bit bland. But I'm curious. What did it do for you? What do you know what it did for you when you read it? Like, or like what kind of sparked?
What I love about words and poetry, because that's poetry in my eyes, is that level of contrast.
Right.
So you know, when you think about activism, you think about you know, protests through the streets, and you might think about the school strikes that have been going on, you know, around the world on Friday, led by Greta. You might think about even more heavy stuff with Interlake Britain literally gluing themselves to roads. It's quite a harsh visual when I think about that word, activism. It doesn't have to be that, but that's ultimately what perhaps my journey, and maybe even just the media, often has kind of led to my perspective of that word. And then you've got love, which is just like this incredible.
Yeah, it's not a business term either. No. Someone said the other day, she was Irish, I think. She said, I've worked in England a lot. I think it might be because I'm English, but the word love in business just makes me really uncomfortable. I said, I don't think it's because you're British. I think it's in general, like, it's not a word that is associated with activism nor with business. You know, it's all about fear and competition and making sure that you're the best. And whereas I think I mean, I'm on a mission to make business more humane and to make it a place where you don't need to be brave to speak up, but it can be somewhere where we actually have conversations. So I think that that's a really important starting point, is that we're all containers and we've got so many different emotions going on at the whole time. And there's one, I actually made these stickers, love is activism activism is love made visible. And it was a moment that this lawyer, who he showed me his phone, he said, I have a daughter and she's in Extinction Rebellion and I don't get her, but she doesn't get me, and we're always struggling and stuff. And I sent her this picture. I saw your sticker and I sent her this picture. And she sent me a heart back, and I just thought, oh, that's so nice, because it was kind of being seen that what she stood for was really important to her, and that he acknowledged that too. So I think there's a connection, that if you start from a feeling of connection, the conversation's different, right? Yeah.
So this is a relatively kind of new part to the journey, isn't it? I think that I'd be really interested to know what you're doing now, what you want to be doing in the future.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the past maybe later on down the conversation.
Yeah. What am I doing? So I think I struggle with saying all the things that I do, and I try to kind of start with why am I doing it, and I think it's around that changing business, or trying to make it more humane. And the past is an incredibly important reason why I do what I do, which is about that collective leadership. And the way I explain it is that coming together around a cause and feeling that you can do something about it is really powerful. And it's something that I noticed setting up a social enterprise with people who came together around it. Interviewing people for the podcast that I make with Impossible around what if we get it right. You know, it's that questioning, the curiosity, experimenting and just trying. And I think that's been the inspiration for the undercover activist, saying, okay, we've got social entrepreneurship, but I think we really need social intrapreneurship, basically, to start changing the world, so that it becomes something that's, because social enterprises can be like a role model of how business can be done, and not to undermine it, but it's just not enough. So I think there's a lot of people that I see in businesses that are, you know, they, especially the younger generation, come in with climate anxiety, a real sense of urgency, and are just hit a brick wall because they see that actually, besides like the purpose that has been advertised internally, not a lot is changing, and they don't have a lot of say. So this undercover activist hub that we're started has been doing a lot of research, listening to stories of people who are in businesses trying to change things, and trying to translate that into learning. So we host an online course, and we have content available for people who want to campaign, let's say, internally, or use an activist mindset to start like changing or influencing from within companies.
And you know, so within both your kind of coaching and consulting work, as well as the podcast, you're looking to move conversations, you know, from the why we have to innovate to the how we need to innovate.
Yeah.
And I love that. But was there a moment in that journey where you're like, oh, I'm just done with people talking about stuff? was there a specific moment?
I can get sick of myself talking about stuff sometimes. I mean, a lot of it is talking, and we need to have conversations. And sometimes conversations themselves is action. You know, if you can have a good conversation, the process of a conversation is action. So I think, especially in activism, you understand that it's a generational thing, or it takes time, and that actually it's not a quick fix. You know, so there's no one solution. There is no one future, but it's the process in which we're having conversations that is going to decide that future. So I think that. So I don't undermine like conversations not being action, but sometimes you do just have to just try things, do it, experiment. You know, totally. Make mistakes, and I think. I mean, I can get stuck in conversations, but because I hate making mistakes.
Yeah.
But I also just do it, you know.
There's often like a strive for perfection as well. It's like, oh, we're not going to trial this thing until we've got it exactly right. But that holds things so much. Yeah. And you know, trial and error is everything. Yeah. Unfortunately, when you have certain organisations or you work within certain systems, it's often the organisations which are being the boldest and trying things that get called out the quickest. And we've seen that specifically within activism. And, you know, even with the kind of XR movement in the UK especially, there was a real momentum happening in 2020. And there was one, maybe two mistakes that were made, which kind of just brought the whole thing down. What's really interesting, you know, we are literally having this conversation because the Blue Earth Summit are bringing thought leaders in lots of different fields together to get them inspired, to learn from thought leaders, to make connections, which is an incredibly valuable thing.
Yeah.
Connections is everything. But there's also workshops.
Yeah.
The whole purpose of why they're bringing people together isn't just to have conversations, it's about making action plans. And, you know, that is an incredibly valuable thing. When you have the best known events in the world supposedly moving the climate message forward, i.e. the COPs,
Yes.
then suddenly being sponsored by the brands that often are the ones that are being called out for being the worst polluters in the world, i.e. Coca-Cola. And the latest news that Coca-Cola is a sponsor of COP27 this year.
You mean Shell? Oh, it's Coca-Cola. Yeah.
You're also thinking
Yes.
about Shell also being the lead sponsor of the UK cycling for the next 8 years until 2030. Like, that's a pretty large contrast, isn't it? Because you've got these networks of conversations happening, these networks of policy being pushed forward, but then they're being financed by the organisations which are obviously the ones that are doing harm at the end of the process. Where do you feel your kind of mind is on that?
Well, I can sense a kind of level of dissociation from you, right? It's like, how can we be, it's good and bad, and they're coming together in one thing that's supposed to be good, and it doesn't match in your mind or something. Whereas I think, yes, these conferences are great, and COP is incredibly important, and the Blue Earth Summit, but I don't know about you, but I always tend to meet, it's great to connect and it's great to strengthen these networks, but they tend to be people who think alike, you know? So
it's the echo chamber, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so from a perspective of change, I see it from a systems perspective that we need all these different voices because they're not going to go away. And we can kind of huddle like in a summit and say, okay, but we're strong now, so we can voice our concerns outwardly. But how can we invite that kind of the other voices into this conference? And I think that that's something that I'm learning about with this undercover activism or the positive workplace activism. Activities that I'm trying to do is how do we actively invite disagreement?
Yeah.
You know, so if you see activism, there's a really good researcher, author on the subject called Megan Wrights, and she says employee activism is voices of difference who are using their influence to question things on social and environmental issues within companies and disrupting the status quo. And I think that when we look at businesses and employee activism, there's a kind of, you know, what are these people doing? And it's usually targeted toward the people who are speaking up, so it becomes very personal. And then it's like, but don't shoot the messenger, you know? They're being brave in voicing something, but how can we create meetings where we have an extra seat at the table, which is the voice of dissent, and everybody can take that voice, or we ask everybody to find a way in which they disagree with what's being said, because then if we think about decisions that are going to be made, we don't just want yay sayers, you know, we don't want everybody to agree, we want people to disagree and to be able to voice that. So I think it's great to feel the mismatch with Coca-Cola and COP, you know, because it makes us have to think about what doesn't make sense and what is it that we do want. Whereas if we were only going to collect the good around us, how do we define what's good, you know, or what's bad in that case? So let's have a conversation about it. And I'm interested in what Coca-Cola has to say.
True, yeah. Do you think that you know, positive workplace activism is the next generation or the next most important thing for truly impactful brands?
When I started with I was thinking about social entrepreneurship when we started. It was like, okay, what's the definition of social entrepreneurship? And everybody had a different definition. And I still think it's kind of depending on what academic study you do. But it feels like it's been institutionalized. Whereas I think corporate activism is something that people are starting to understand. Which is, you know, Patagonia or you speaking out as a brand on certain issues, public and social issues, but that's as a brand. And employee activism is different again, because it's really about people internally speaking up against their company. And it's not a democracy in a company, right? So you need to understand, what are your rights to speak up?
Yeah.
You could just be fired, and not everybody has the chance or the choice or the privilege to speak up. So what is it, and how are we going to define it, I guess, and how are we going to make it part of your business degree or your other degree, you know? And it's not just as a person speaking up, but as a manager, how do I deal with voices of dissent? How do I make it part of not just a business, it could be anything. So I think in that sense, activism will never go away, but can we have some of it, please, you know, in our work environments? Yeah.
So what kind of tips would you give a boss or a manager in being able to, I guess, enable and facilitate a progressive workplace?
Yeah. I'm going to steal some of these from Megan Rice, but she talks about speaking up and listening up power, speaking up and listening up power, which is don't depend on your people to speak up, but take initiative and listen up. So one, I think, is whatever you bring into the room as a manager is what will be talked about. So if there is a topical issue, you know, around maybe Shell and cycling, bring it up, have a conversation about it, because it's probably alive with your employees. And I think somebody said, you can't outsource listening, like all these surveys that people do. Oh, what I did this survey and all this data, you know, proves blah, blah, blah. But it's like, it's actually, you have to also listen and not just to what people are saying, I think. And that's something that's also a cultural thing, you know, I think. And the second, I mean, for me, what I strongly believe in is that leadership is not embodied by one person or by management or, you know, in hierarchical structures. I think that leadership can come from different people. And it doesn't mean that everybody has to be on the barricades and, you know, speaking up. I think we all, as someone said, have our role in the revolution. But people can do different things, you know, and I think that if we can make space for that, then, yeah.
It's really interesting because, you know, Enviral are going through a journey at the moment as we scale up. There are a number of different things that happen within our organisational behaviour and our culture that, you know, ultimately I've never done before. I've never gone through that before.
Yeah.
We as a group of people, you know, we're working together to find out what the answers are. And, you know, as a white privileged male, I have blind spots. And one of the most important things that as a group we have been able to do, and we're certainly not perfect, but we've been able to start the journey, is to create a safe space to talk about these things. So ultimately in that space, that a male might have a louder voice, maybe has had some coffee that morning and jumps in and talks over perhaps a female who's more experienced in that specific topic, but might have been, you know, that half a second moment of pause to think about the answer, and then they don't get the spotlight on maybe a Zoom call, for example, which is actually really hard when you're not in the room together because you can't have that energy. It's something that, you know, you've got to have those conversations to be able to aware that that's a thing that you can't do in the future. It's a behaviour that often we have to unlearn. And, you know, specifically when you're talking about minority ethnic communities, you know, when you're talking about less represented communities in certain industries, and the communications world has got a real problem, genuinely. You know, if we depend on a job needing certain skills, which perhaps revolve around the use of very expensive cameras or software, and certain communities haven't ever had exposure and learning to those specific softwares or cameras or equipment, it's very hard as a leader to be able to take that risk in a business environment, specifically in an economic crossroads right now, to be able to say, oh, you know, we're going to train up different communities so that we can be, you know, as inclusive as possible. But it is literally leaders' responsibility to do that, because nobody else is going to do it. how do you balance that when there is an economic climate like now, when ultimately we're in a position where we're having to often keep businesses afloat and risk manage?
Yeah.
But we also need to be, specifically organisations like B Corps, be the leading light in how business behaviour has to be different in the future. It's a really tricky balance, isn't it? But something that we have to do.
Yeah. That's a long intro. I was curious, but maybe that's for later, how you created a safe space in your organization.
Facilitation.
So you have an outward, someone from outside comes in.
We had an external facilitator in progressive ways of working.
Okay.
Who came in. In fact, didn't come in. We went out.
Right.
We went out into nature. Really important, actually, to get away from the workplace, to make sure there's no laptops or, no notifications happening. Yeah. And we spent time together, and we used specific techniques to be able to enable those conversations. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And it's a huge conversation on diversity and inclusion. And I mean, frankly, it's confusing. As personally, I see it as really confusing. I grew up in Hong Kong, which is like one of the last colonial places to which identity for me was just like, who am I? I'm a Dutch person living in an English colony in China. I think I thought President Reagan was the president of the world when I grew up. It's like, I had no connection with community, And my partner, his mum is Indian South African. She moved around a lot. So there's a lot, like, our colonial history is so close. I'm a product of that. And for me, it's been such a part of who I am. So for these couple of years have just been like being confronted and like learning and having these conversations and trying to understand, and I still feel like I'm kind of searching for this kind of bedding that I'm in. So I feel like to come from a place of humility, perhaps, and saying, I have no idea, like, teach me. What am I missing? I think that's a really good starting point, because I agree. I think if leaders, as in managers, have to figure out the problem of how to involve more people in their workforce in different areas, then you're, again, not in a negative way, but you're relying on some kind of person who's going to come up with all the solutions. Whereas I think if you say, okay, this is what we want, how are we going to do it? Then we've got such a much bigger brain, and it's not about, maybe it isn't that the way we see the future of diversity and inclusion is the same way that everybody sees it, So I think it's that conversation and trying to figure out together, like, how are we going to do this? Yeah. And we don't have the answers, So let's talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and just be aware that we're on a journey, but we need to move fast.
Yeah, yeah.
And we need to trial and error and experiment.
And I think Corona, in that sense, I've spoken to companies who said, I won't mention them, but big global companies that said, because we couldn't be on the ground in certain locations, they had to figure it out themselves. And they come up with the most amazing solutions, right. Because they had no headquarters telling them how to do it, because they're so much more connected to their communities and their locations, so they knew how to deal with stuff. And you see it from, I don't know, daycare, where I take my children. They're all owned by hedge funds, and I think, these people on the ground, they know how to deal with children, but they've got, like, this is your budget, this is how much you get to do, and it has nothing to do anymore, but it's that scale. But then we can scale, but who's that benefiting, really, And I think those are, if you don't give people the means to solve their own problems, and you think you have to solve the problem, then you're still in that same mindset of, I'll solve the diversity and inclusion problem, where it's like, wait, maybe you're not the person here who has to solve it. You just need to admit that actually, the leadership needs to come from somewhere else. Yeah.
Tell us about the Fairphone journey, and I'm really intrigued to know where that started.
Yeah.
And what were the kind of core learnings that you had through that journey?
How did it start? So I think for me, I like, where it started is I'd been freelancing. I had just had my second son, and I was like, what am I going to do? And I met Bas van Abel, who was just thinking about setting up a social enterprise, and I'd also applied for a job with a big PR firm, and I'd gone through like a couple of different application procedures, and by Christmas, both of them said, you've got the job. And I remember asking everybody in my community, like my friends, my peers, what should I do? And they were like, no, you should go for the big, the PR job. You'll learn a lot and everything. Except for my mum and my partner, which is, it's great. But I think I knew that I wanted to go with a social enterprise. And there was nothing there except a promise. I mean, there was a built community, which was incredibly important, and a concept. But the idea was we had 400,000 and we were going to build a phone in a year. And we had 2 people on board, and I just thought, let's just do it. This is fun. This is going to be an adventure. Let's do it.
Yes.
So I think for me, looking back is very different from being in it. I think when I look back now, I think it was such a, you get these kind of hubs for energy, I think, everywhere, where people come together around these things that they want to change. That's for me, Fairphone was such a platform, I guess, for different people to connect to their personal passion. So whether it was on technology, we need to change products, or conflict areas, we need to address the conflict minerals, to working conditions, to waste programs, or even I'm a lawyer and I think intellectual property should be different. People all had these skills, and they were they were in charge of how are we going to do this, So I think that first starting period, I think they call it effectuation in academia. It's something is as big as you, your knowledge, and your network. So it really depends on the people that come together. And I think, it's funny, we met this company called Puzzle Phone along the way, and they were a group of 30 engineers, and we were a group of 20 campaigners basically, and designers and communications experts, and we didn't have a lot of technologists the first couple of years, and they didn't have any communicators, So I think it took a couple of years for Fairphone to really establish itself as a phone making company, that the phone was a real alternative to what's out there. And before that, it was very much a campaign of I'm going to buy into this because I know if I believe in this product, then I can help it on its next leg and on its journey. So the starting point was we are Fairphone. Nous sommes Fairphone was how it started. It's how can we build this company? And I think that was really, the first couple of years, it's just you get goosebumps, people who'd offer stuff to you or make it happen, or allies in the business. And I think that that's something that's really stayed with me over the years.
And why a phone?
Why a phone?
Yeah.
Fairphone started as an awareness-raising campaign around the use of conflict minerals in the Congo. And at the time, it was VAC Society that said an action aid. And they said, we need to do a campaign around this. And Bas van Abel, who was working at Fairphone together with the action aid, said, yeah, great, we can do a campaign. And then what? So then people will know that their phones contain conflict minerals, but it's not like they have an alternative or a choice or anything. So the campaign itself became this idea of, okay, if we made a phone differently, then we could address this conflict minerals. And then from there it grew to what other interventions are there? How are phones made actually? So they started taking phones apart and understanding the story. And the idea was nobody in the world knows how this phone really came together. So if we use it as a storytelling tool or an object that we're trying to take apart and understand, then we can start making interventions and changing the way things are made.
So somebody in a meeting somewhere was like, should we just make the
phone? Make a phone, yeah. But it's Milton Friedman has this example around the invisible hand of our economy, and he uses a pencil. He says, the pencil, the wood came from there, and the graphite came from there, and the rubber, blah, blah, blah. And he just says, it's the invisible hand of our economy. And I just thought, if only we were making a pencil, or a chair or something like that, because a phone itself is so difficult.
So complex.
Yeah, it's so complex, yeah.
Ultimately, there's got to be a level of resilience to be one. There's got to be a level of real adventure.
Yeah.
To go and take on the biggest companies in the world, to show that you can do it differently. There's also got to be a level of resilience to keep going. Is that something that you learn at Fairphone? Especially when you're going up against the kind of Apples, the Samsungs, who've got billions of pounds in marketing budget.
Yeah, What did you say it was? You said it was to go against a sense of adventure. We called it to be strategically naive, just to just say, we're not a pain in the ass. There's the problems that bigger companies have, we don't have, but we're small, we're innovative. We just want to understand how it works, So could you educate us, because we know that we don't want to do this, so how does it work? And I think that was, for me, incredibly important at the beginning, framing Fairphone as a platform that we needed people to come on board, because there is no such thing as a Fairphone. So we need everybody to come and to work together on how could we then create a Fairphone. So, and that made it a welcoming adventure, let's say that. And we never, I think, publicly worked with these bigger companies, but more indirectly, people would contact us, and they would share, we would share in smaller kind of working groups and everything. So it was like an ongoing learning experience, I think, that really made it the powerful thing that it is. And it is that kind of leading by example, I don't know, and we're going to make mistakes, but let's just try, so I think that was really important. And when you talk about resilience, I know that was a word that came up for us in the kind of more scaling time. Like, how do we go from being a startup to being a scale up? And I was always concerned that our biggest threat was from the outside. They're gonna wipe us out with some kind of indeed marketing campaign or something. But it was actually internal organizational stuff and scaling up that proved to be incredibly difficult and quite a constraint on the company. And I know that, Bas van Abel, he left as a founder, burned out for a while. There were different and managers that came in, and I think that the pressure on growing a company when you are an adventurer, now you're a CEO, and how do you create that company, and how do you scale up? So I was thinking about resilience yesterday. I thought, you really know what resilience is when you are no longer resilient. When you find that you are that place where you there's no stretch left in you. And I thought, when was the last time I was right at the end of Corona with 3 kids and all those rules, and I couldn't go to school and I couldn't go to work, and every day there was just this new thing that kind of changed my day again, without any warning, and I thought, I sat on the stairs and I was just crying. I was just like, oh, am I going to do this? And I thought, so that's and is that the moment that you say enough and that you ask for help? And how can we recognize that in advance, or how do we talk about what is too much before we get to that place of we're not stretching? So I think if you work in a startup or a scale up, you need to be adaptable. So you're constantly adapting to new situations and uncertainty and complexity. But that needs to be something, I think, that you recognize and maybe put more effort into self-care and understand when is pressure too much, and internal, external pressures. Yeah. So yeah.
Totally. I think a lot of people are going to really resonate with that one. And I guess that's that journey, that there's various scenarios that you have gone through, the highs, the lows.
Yeah.
That's where you've landed with the Undercover Activist, and that's the future.
For now. I'm also doing a project on the code for children's rights, how to create technology that incorporates children's rights in the design of things. But I keep busy around social. So I think what's important to me, so someone said, can I introduce her? She founds things. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, but I think it's more about how do we navigate. So if there's an issue, societal or environmental issue, it's not that I have answers that I'm really passionate about energy, or it's more about how do we create something, how do we navigate that complexity and make it something understandable to talk about and to identify who else is involved, what is this ecosystem around it, and what are the interests, and how can we come together around it. So I think that's important for me. It's it's so interconnected, everything. But it's just also fascinating to figure out how it works and who to involve and how to get people to kind of work together on addressing things. Yeah.
So to bring it to a close, because you're going to be speaking on stage very soon.
Yes.
What are you hoping to get from today's panel? What are you talking about? You're also sharing the stage with some pretty amazing people, including Gail Bradbrook from XR, founder of XR.
Yeah.
So what is the panel today?
So the first, I'm actually speaking at two. So the first is a panel on centre stage with Gail Bradbrook and Caroline Dennett. She wrote a letter to her. She was a contractor for Shell for 11 years and wrote a letter. You might know her. And I'm, everybody. I always suffer from imposter syndrome. I think two amazing women on this stage. So.
3 amazing women on this stage.
And Keme, I think, is the moderator. I think for me it's about, I guess it's, so I would really like to talk about employee activism. So not corporate activism necessarily as like how we as brands or companies come together, but really how do we create safe spaces like you were talking about? How do we invite disagreement? How can we see love, activism as love made visible rather than kind of be afraid of it? So these are things that I'd like to start. I'd like to start Spark, that people can think about it. And my question actually is like, who is doing stuff internally that recognizes this? And how can you put me in touch with people who are, just to understand, like to create these stories and to see whether we can learn from people who are actually doing it. Yeah.
I think it's going to be a real interesting space to be doing that, because you have literally founders, you have interns, you have students, you have adventurers, so many different people from so many different backgrounds. And I think coming in from the whole of Europe to the event. So
nice. And there's a second.
I was going to say, I was about to get to that.
With Cressa Wessling, who I admire.
Amazing.
She's wonderful.
Such a legend.
And Jarvis, I'm not entirely sure his name is, but they're the starting point for conversation is if you're capable, you're responsible. So that's my question to you. Do you feel that if you're capable, you're responsible?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, it's such an interesting space. What I love about, and I know that Cress is one of the founding B Corps in the UK. There's a methodology and a belief that from certain organisations who I don't want to say who truly get it, but it's not about being perfect. It's about consistent improvement and continuous improvement. And I think everybody's responsible. And that said, though, there are certain people in organisations which are more responsible than others.
Yeah.
and I take ownership for things that happen potentially in client work that had to be changed at last minute, even if I wasn't involved in that specific project, because I am in the position of guiding the organisation, not necessarily leading, because actually we're all leaders. Everybody in our organisation is a leader. But I think it is an interesting conversation to be had. I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes. And what are you specifically looking for out of that? Is there any kind of tips that you're looking to kind of share with the audience?
I'm really hoping to unravel that statement with the audience, because I feel like what is capable? What are we talking about when we say capable? Is everybody just capable, or does it matter on your?
It's funny because that's literally what popped up in my head.
Yeah.
When you asked that, what is capable? Maybe
and what is responsible? I mean, my biggest allergy at home is when my children, I have 3 sons, don't take responsibility. It's just like, who did this? I didn't do it. And I'm like, you're not going to get punished, but just tell me who did it. You know, it's like, why is it so tough to kind of go, oh, I did that. So just taking responsibility for me is like, it's such it's almost a threat, of taking, what happens when you take responsibility. And I feel overly responsible for things. So sometimes I should learn to not take responsibility. Really? But yeah, so I think it's just unraveling it at the moment, because I don't know what it means really fully. Yeah.
So to end, 3 quickfire questions. Recommendation of a podcast and you're totally, in fact, encouraged to say your own one.
What if we get it right? I think I'd like the podcast concept because it's very much a questioning concept on what if we get it right, interviewing entrepreneurs from around the world based on the Sustainable Development Goals, how they embrace that in their company. But I listened to a podcast by Brené Brown interviewing Megan Wrights and John Higgins on employee activism, which I really recommend.
Okay.
And that's it for now.
And book recommendation? Favorite book?
Oh, I'm reading Emergent Strategy right now by Adrienne Marie Brown, which is very much around, because when you said something about in businesses, that certain people speak up and other people don't, is that I sat in businesses and my whole body would just like heat up, and I'd be like, okay, this isn't right, but how do I express what I'm saying? Okay, I should just, suppress it.
Suppress it.
Yeah. So I think, and this is very much around, well, what is in the room, what is emergent, how do we give it a space without having to give it words yet? So I think that this is for me, I like this idea of emergent strategy, that there's so much in the room and how do we work with that? So that's a real recommendation, yeah.
And finally, favourite music to put on to either just escape or to think about something that's really, really cool?
Oh, gosh, I'm not so I'm going to... Water Pistol, no. That's my husband's, he's a musician and he plays that, and it's actually really good. It really resonates
we should totally
with me.
say that. Let's pick up Water Pistol.
There you go.
I love it. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tessa.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank
honestly,
you.
it was so great to chat, and can't wait to see the panels that you're on today, and also just spend time getting inspired by lots of different people.
Yeah, thanks for giving me a runway to get ready. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, so good to have Tessa on the podcast. Her latest company, Undercover Activist, really grabbed my attention in LinkedIn with this tagline that she's got, which is "Activism is love made visible," which we started the conversation on. And having seen her speak at the Blue Earth Summit, I think she has an incredible knowledge base for transformational change, which is clearly so important for positive impact in organisations. And look, I know a number of organisations which are purpose-driven, from multinational conglomerates to smaller B Corps, who know that if their organisational structure and their employee interaction was better, they could be making even more impact. And she's a real expert in this. And I loved her perception on certain things. And I loved things like bravery and the importance of feedback. The fact that we are ultimately striving for perfection constantly. But no matter which organisation, if you're Patagonia or a seasoned collective consultancy, no organisation is perfect. And ultimately, by having employee activism, through having psychological safety, impact can really be as good as it can be. So thank you, Tessa. I've really enjoyed today's episode, and thank you, listeners, for listening to the Shifting Narrative podcast. If you ever fancy reaching out to me, then please do on LinkedIn or zing and viral an email. And mad appreciation for making it this far. We've got some amazing episodes coming out in the next few weeks. So over and out, Joss.